to our last colloquium of the year. Our presenter this afternoon is Dr. Douglas Parry, and his talk is entitled Social Media Use and Wellbeing, so breaking the empirical deadlock and moving beyond the media panic. So Dr. Parry is a senior lecturer in the Department of Information Science, specifically the Cognition and Technology Research Group here at Stellenbosch University. And he has research interests at the intersection of communication science, human-computer interaction, as well as media psychology. His research aims to understand the role that digital media plays in the lives of children, adolescents, and early adults, and primarily concerns users' mental health, well-being, and attention. So he looks at cognition control and goal pursuit, as well as the regulation or management of media use and the evaluation and improvement of research methods in these domains. So his work draws on theories and methods from the social and computational sciences and regularly involves computational social science methods to collect and analyze behavioral trace data to augment survey or interview or focus group data on media use and its effects. So his work has been published in leading journals such as Nature, Human Behavior, Technology, Mind and Behavior, Information Technology and People, Computers in Education, and Computers in Human Behavior. So these are quite impressive journals. So for those of you who are more interested, who would like more information on Doug and the work that he does, you can visit his website, which is dougaparry.com. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Parry. Doug, thanks so much for being here. We very much look forward to your talk. This afternoon, Doug will present for about 30 to 40 minutes or so, following which we will enter into a discussion where audience members can ask Doug questions or pose comments at the end. So thanks very much, Doug, and over to you.
Thanks, Bronwyn, and thanks for inviting me to speak today. Hopefully everything's fine with my audio and with my slides.
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. So I've met some of you online before and maybe in faculty board, but for most, I'm probably a new face. So Bronwyn did give some introduction there. So I'm a senior lecturer in socioinformatics in the Department of Information Science at Stellenbosch. And as Bronwyn said, I'm interested in the ways in which digital media shape how we communicate and how this communication affects individuals, how it affects organizations, how it affects society. And in general, I'm interested in media uses and effects, so things like multitasking, distraction, mental health, as well as then the ways in which people respond to these effects in their lives to manage and regulate their media use. And then, which will come across in this talk, I'm also interested in a lot of meta research on methods and tools and techniques that we use in these different areas. So in this talk, I'm going to provide an overview of existing debates about the effects of social media use and focus on the methodological factors that have contributed to the poor state of evidence that we're faced with in this area. I'm going to draw on a recent paper, which I'll talk about at the end. I'm going to focus on how 5 key methodological factors can help bring us closer to understanding whether, how, and for whom social media use can have either harmful or actually supportive effects on users' mental health and well-being. So perhaps first let's have some context here. I'm sure we've all seen these or similar headlines, or maybe it was the Social Dilemma documentary from a few years back. Whatever it is, social media effects have captured the zeitgeist. I can't go a day without seeing on Twitter or X or Blue Sky or whatever the platform is, hearing about how TikTok is destroying a generation, or how Instagram is producing depression epidemics, or how social media echo chambers are creating political turmoil. So there's this steady stream of news and highlighting these negative effects of social media. And alongside this steady stream of op-eds and commentaries and articles, there was a recent expose in the Wall Street Journal about a year or so ago, which sparked renewed public interest in the potential negative effects of social media use for, in this case, particularly adolescents' mental health, but it does extend to a larger population. This article was titled "Facebook knows Facebook knows that Instagram is toxic for teen girls." And the article exposed internal research that Meta, which owns Facebook, conducted on, in this case, Instagram. And the findings of this research, which until this point had been kept private, show that the the platform knew, or the company knew, that being on Instagram was making the site's younger users worry about how attractive they are, and making a sizable proportion of them feel worse about themselves and exacerbating mental health problems. This at least was the opinion of the researchers at Facebook. And I've had a conversation with the researchers who ran this study. I was in Canada earlier in the year, and this is their belief as a platform, that certain ways of using it can have these negative effects on users' mental health. And while some people in the media have been taking these headlines proclaiming the widespread negative effects at face value, other commentators, other researchers, other experts in the areas have been more suspicious of the veracity of the claims of the platforms, and they've actually questioned the quality of the methods used to collect and analyze the data. So in this case here, this is Stuart Ritchie, who's a prominent British science communicator and psychologist, and he was arguing here that the quality of the company, so the quality of Meta's own research into mental health, is actually abysmal. The way that they go about researching these different uses of their platforms. And we should, in that case, then be very suspicious of these claims in the media. And this is a sort of indicative of a larger trend in this particular area. So, despite what the headlines might say that I showed on the previous slide, research on social media effects has not converged on many agreed upon effects. There's often a disconnect between public opinion, between people's experiences, and what we actually find in the research. So while some studies appear to corroborate the fears that people have, that we might have about our social media use, and they find that those who use social media more often can become more depressed or more anxious, or whatever the outcome of interest might be. But there's other recent examinations of large nationally representative data sets often challenge this notion that social media use is as harmful as we might think. And in particular, most meta-analyses of these effects reveal that findings for negative effects of social media are either null, tiny, or they're extremely heterogeneous. And there's also a lot of differences among researchers. So some of you might have been exposed to the debates among various different camps or schools of thought on various online platforms. There are some researchers who argue that there are negative effects. There are other researchers who argue that there isn't any evidence of effects, or that there are flaws in the studies that have shown effects. And I think cutting through these debates and these differences, despite all these different concerns that commentators might have or researchers might have, most people agree, and pretty much everyone agrees, that social media effects, they're an important 21st century concern, that we need more research to understand, are there negative effects? For whom are there negative effects? What types of usage may be supportive or harmful? And what can we do about these potential negative effects? We can't simply write it off and ignore it and say that effects are null and there's nothing there. But if we say that more research is needed, what kind of research is needed? What should we be doing to resolve this empirical deadlock and move beyond these null effects, or these tiny effect sizes, or highly heterogeneous results? What should we be doing as researchers? So in this talk, I'm going to focus on advances in 5 areas that I think can help us understand whether, how, and for whom social media affects well-being, as well as in positive and in negative ways. And I'm drawing on a paper that was now published about a year ago in Current Opinion in Psychology, in which we were asked to summarize methodological advances in this area. So to this point, or at least until the last few years, most studies investigating social media effects have relied on observational designs. So for years, we've basically been sending out one-off surveys to infer correlations or group differences for mental health outcomes. Some of my first studies when I was a master's student and an early PhD student followed this exact design. And while I definitely don't want to write off cross-sectional research, it can tell us a lot about associations at between person levels and reveal what are potential interventions or potential avenues for delving further. These designs can't tell us about causal dynamics or temporal dynamics that link social media use and well-being. They also can't meaningfully inform us about within-person effects and mediation effects in cross-sectional designs. So for these, we need more longitudinal data, and we need more experiments to get at causality in our research. And as I have on the slide there, there's very few experiments in this area. Over 70% of studies in a recent analysis are cross-sectional, and less than about 10% are longitudinal, with maybe just about 20% of studies being experimental. So they're still relatively rare. Social media experiments tend to take on one of three forms, and they generally involve either the use of mock-ups of a platform, or the abstention from using the actual platform in the course of someone's lives. So, for instance, as part of my PhD research a couple of years ago, I did a small-scale abstention experiment, essentially where I had participants use the app that I have a screenshot on the screen there to, in various ways that I specified as part of the study, manage and restrict and control when and how they use their smartphones for certain types of usage, with the idea that over the course of a month or so of using these restrictions, we would affect a number of outcomes that we were interested. So this taught me many things, not least of which is the difficulty of actually implementing experiments outside of lab conditions in people's everyday context. And while we need more of these types of experiments to learn about how particular usage patterns affect our well-being, experimenting with behavior in the wild comes with a lot of inherent challenges. This isn't as simple as sending out a survey to 5,000 people and getting your responses. And this is now, as this area of research begins to start to think about experiments, we need to carefully consider how the manipulation that we're using, so whether it's just no social media or not using particular apps or at particular times or whatever the case might be, how will that manipulation induce the outcomes that we might expect? How will this benefit someone's well-being? And what duration of experiment is actually needed for these effects to appear? So in the early days, a couple of years ago, many experiments typically tended to be about 30 days or 1 month. That's what I used in my PhD. And in retrospect, that was way too short. We need to do experiments that last 30, 40, 60, 90 days to start to see any types of effects here. Alongside this, as you saw, we don't have many longitudinal studies in this area. Only in the last few years have longitudinal methods begun to gain some more prominence in social media research. This is especially the case for large-scale panel surveys, for which it's often a pretty lengthy process to actually get scales and measures included in these surveys. And these surveys tend to follow panels of participants, mostly in the global north, over a period of years. They've typically relied on self-reports of social media use, and they've generally produced mixed results with tiny effect sizes. So earlier this year, I actually analyzed my first longitudinal data set in which we conducted a 4-wave panel study in the US involving data donations. So that's where the participants provided us with access to their usage tracking applications on their phones 4 times throughout the study, as well as then combining that with various well-being outcomes. So I'm using this longitudinal data set to investigate 2 separate questions. And the first is a descriptive question, which concerns the consistency of the applications that people use over time and the order in which they use these applications. And we call this an application repertoire. So if you think about the apps that you have installed on your phone, you've probably got 20, 30, 40 apps, but you probably only end up using 5 to 10 of them relatively consistently for most of the time that you use on your phone. So that's the first question we're looking at. And then in the second question, we're using cross-slag panel models to investigate within-person relations with well-being over 4 months to see again, do we actually find anything looking at this in relation to particular applications. Another prominent area or promising development is the growing use of intensive longitudinal designs. So by intensive longitudinal designs, I mean longitudinal research over a shorter period of time where we collect multiple measures per day. So here in this area, we use what's called the experience sampling method, and we might have participants fill out or complete 3, 4, 5 surveys a day, where the surveys are very short. They might have 10 items, where the items are sliders or yes, no responses or things like that, 4 or 5 times a day for, say, something like 7 days. And this allows us to close the gap between our measures of usage and our measures of well-being. If you ask people over the last hour, what were you doing on your phone, and how do you feel about that, or how do you feel in general, versus a retrospective survey where you're asking someone on average over the past week, or in general, or in the last month, there's a large lag between the measure and the events taking place there, especially when it comes to something like social media, where you're using very particular features at very particular times throughout the day. And these ESM methods allow us to disentangle within-person effects from between-person effects. And we can also, with ESM, gather sufficient data on a particular individual. You can imagine if I'm asking someone to fill out 5 surveys a day for 2 weeks, and I might end up with 70 data points for that individual. I can fit a model for each person in my data set. And there's this growing use of these person-specific models in this area to try understand the temporal and individual dynamics of how social media use relates to well-being. But as I sort of alluded to there, most studies social media use and well-being use self-report measures of usage. So this is despite decades of research demonstrating that when it comes to very frequent behaviors that are highly habitual, that are embedded throughout our daily lives, that are especially short. You might open your phone for 30 seconds or 10 seconds, respond to a message, put it back, open it again a couple of minutes later and respond to another message. These sorts of behaviors are very difficult to accurately reflect on, perceive, and remember due to various cognitive and perceptual biases. And in this area, in a recent meta-analysis, along with some other colleagues, I've shown that this relationship between estimates of social media usage and measures of usage that come from trackers, from logging applications, from directly from platforms using APIs, or from data donations where participants provide us with records of their actual social media use. The relationship between these two measures is too small to conclude that they reliably measure the same thing. So there is some overlap. There is a positive correlation between an estimate of how long someone spends on social media and an actual measure of their usage. This correlation is too small. It's insufficient for what you would expect from measures that measure the same thing. And if we accept that logs of actual social media usage, that's measures from trackers, measures from other things that record how long you actually spend on a particular app, they're also going to be biased in various ways. But they are likely to be a better representation, at least at an aggregate level, of actual usage. So if we accept this, this weak relationship suggests that the self-reports that most research in this area, and this is probably 95% plus of research in this area, uses estimates of how long someone has spent on social medias to refer and infer a relationship with their well-being, their mental health, their attention. This weak relationship suggests that these self-reports, they may not actually be good reflections of participants' actual behavior. And then if studies aren't measuring behavior, but they're trying to measure behavior, it raises questions about validity of many of the conclusions based on this work. If these studies aren't measuring behavior, but they're measuring people's perceptions of their behavior, we need to think quite carefully about what that means for our findings. Because as a colleague of mine, Craig Sewell in the States, and I showed here, a lot of things can affect perceptions of our behavior. So in this case, in recent work, we've demonstrated that for various outcomes, in this case, it was depression, the outcomes interact with people's ability to estimate their own behavior. When asked to reflect over the last week, over the last day, over the last month on your actions and come up with an estimate of how often you might have used social media, that is going to be affected by everything that affects your perceptions of how you frame social media, of how you reflect on the passage of time in your life, and various things like that. So here we use something called cubic response surface analysis to investigate the discrepancy between someone's actual usage and their estimate of their usage and how that interacts with their depression in this case here. And this systematic bias further exacerbates problems with existing studies that have relied on self-reports. If they're aiming to understand how someone's social media use relates to their depression, but depression creates a bias in the measure of social media use, that causes problems for the actual relationship that's trying to be investigated there in those studies. So there's of course much that we need to learn about the accuracy and biases that go into these usage logs. They are a much better measure of actual usage than self-reports. And in this paper, we argue that more research on social media effects should use these log-based methods to capture participants' actual behavior. That said, while I believe that this behavioral data, which is what we call this, while it presents a more accurate approximation of someone's usage duration or their usage frequency, we have to think about these high-level measures and question if they provide sufficient nuance to properly understand how, let alone whether social media use is actually linked with well-being. So if you think about your use of social media, until the last year or two, most studies relied on measures of how much time did you spend on a platform or how frequently did you log in and log out of that platform. Now, if you think about everything that you do on social media, if you think of all the types of affordances, all the interaction practices, all the different content that makes up social media you use, the people you might interact with, the usage context, all the different usage experiences, I hope you can sort of come to agree with me that these high-level usage metrics of how long did you spend on a platform or how frequently did you log into the platform, it's not sufficient to capture usage. It's not nuanced enough to describe the diversity of what social media use actually is. And what that means for us is that these log-based or these tracking measures that only track usage duration or usage frequency, while they're an improvement over estimates, they are an improved method for measuring something that's relatively limited. Our ability to investigate and understand this relationship between social media use and well-being based only on measures of how long someone spends on social media won't take us very far. So if we want to use behavioral data, we need to figure out ways to produce more nuanced measures of platform actions and user engagement than simply looking at the length or the duration for which someone was on the social media platform. And we can combine these measures with other measures of users' reactions or responses to provide a more holistic view of usage. So I've sort of alluded to this idea of data donation, and it's not something I've seen used a lot in South Africa, but at least in Europe with the GDPR regulations, large platforms are now compelled to provide users access to all the data that they have on them on the platform. Now, this presents quite a unique opportunity for researchers because we can ask participants and obviously explain all the details of what they need to do to go and request, that we call it a data download packet from, say, something like Instagram or like Facebook or whatever the platform might be. And they can then provide these data download packets to researchers. Now, there's obviously huge ethical concerns that we need to deal with here because these packets contain every picture that you've liked, every message that you've sent, every comment that you've added, all of that on the platform. So I'm collaborating with some researchers in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, to essentially develop a platform where participants can upload their data download packets, and it remains entirely, it doesn't ever enter the hands of the researchers. And this platform will allow them to selectively indicate what they do and don't share with the researchers. So maybe they don't want to share any of their private messages or any of the things that they've liked. They only want to share what they've posted or whatever the case might be. So it allows the users to have more control over what they're sharing. But regardless, data donation is a growing area of opportunity in this area of research, to understand exactly what people are doing on platforms and try to see how that relates to their well-being. We're also using experience sampling methods and combining that with behavioral data. So using these momentary assessments where we're tracking with logs on someone's device what they're doing, and then asking them questions throughout the day of how they react to the actions on the platform. Another possibility, so these are all quite user-centered approaches. Another possibility is to get data directly from the technology companies through partnerships. And I'm involved with a number of initiatives pushing these social media companies to actually expand access to their to data for researchers. But this is challenging both for technical reasons as well as for ethics and privacy reasons. For how do you provide access to researchers to data in a way that that doesn't violate the user's privacy? And this data is huge data. You can't just download 1,000 gigabytes onto your computer to analyze that data. So there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built to enable these types of partnerships. So in another project which I published last year, I was working with Mozilla Firefox, who create the Firefox browser, on a study which we had access to the entire browsing history with informed consent of 15,000 users, as well as with survey data from these users on their digital well-being and their desires to spend less time online. And while the findings were what they were, the main thing we actually learned from that project was the difficulty of partnering with these tech companies and the hurdles, both legal as well as technical, that you have to overcome to work with the technology company to access the data that they have on our behavior. But I believe, and I know many others believe, that these companies have access to data on human behavior at a scale that we've never seen. And that data shouldn't be locked up in for-profit companies that only they can do research and understand how human behavior works online. So figuring out ways that we can enable research access while still maintaining privacy is a key challenge and a key thing that many researchers are working on in this area. But despite all of this attention on measurement validity, most studies in this area still focus on associations between, as I said, usage duration or usage frequency and well-being. And as I said earlier, social media use, it's not a single construct. Think about the platforms you use: Twitter, X, Instagram, Facebook, whatever it is, the different types of people that you interact with, the different types of content that you interact with, the different ways you share content, video content, images, short videos, reactions, likes, retweets, whatever that might be. Collapsing all of that into a single measure of how long did you spend on all social media, or how long did you spend on Facebook, is not sufficient to capture all of that nuance. So in this paper, we're arguing that we need more nuanced measures that focus on how rather than how much social media were used, to actually understand not only the existence of, but also the mechanisms that might drive relationships between social media use and well-being. So we need to shift from these aggregate usage metrics like total usage time towards these more holistic, user-centered metrics that capture the diverse ways in which social media can be used. We also need to develop measures that account for this diversity of usage, but we need to focus on nuanced aspects that surround social media use. So by that, I mean the context of use. One form of use might be appropriate in one context and might support my well-being in one context, or support my attention or my performance in one context. But in another context, that same behavior might be harmful to my well-being, or harmful to my performance. And if we ignore context, we miss out on that. And we also need to look at the media ecologies in which usage is situated. So by media ecologies, I mean, in many cases, we interact with the same people across multiple platforms, or we interact with different content in different ways on different platforms. So to understand how things interact there. And most importantly is the subjective experiences of usage, or the meanings people attach to their social media use, and their reactions, their attitudes, their beliefs, their mindsets about their social media use. So I was on a platform, a panel at a conference in May on this very topic, where we were talking about, there's this debate here about active and passive social media use, where the idea is that active social media use can be beneficial, but passive social media use is harmful. And on this panel, we were saying this is probably true, but we need to move beyond that and look past that and what's next. And perhaps a bit of a trigger warning for those who might be sensitive to language. We were one of the panelists was interviewing Dutch adolescents about their experience on social media use, and to try and understand their mindsets, their attitudes. What was it about different? Why some users might have received benefits from their use, while other users felt that their usage harmed them. And in one of the interviews, the girls talked about receiving nude images from boys in their class, and how this, for some users, this was extremely traumatic experience, and for other users, for other girls that were interviewed in the study, they were able to brush this off, and it wasn't something that negatively affected them. And if you had just focused on the content, or just focused on the usage duration, you wouldn't have seen these two different outcomes from the same event. So understanding the people that are using social media is, I think, quite obvious, but unfortunately not something that has been studied in this area for a long time. Most studies have just focused on usage duration in relationship to various well-being outcomes. And we argue that you need a lot more nuanced conception of usage beyond simply those factors there. But in addition to this, we also need to acknowledge the heterogeneity of social media effects. So most social media effects research has relied on a nomothetic between-person approach to data analysis, which essentially aggregates data across individuals. So these types of analyses, your standard correlational analyses and so on, they essentially assume that social media effects are relatively homogeneous across individuals, and that we can generalize these effects within populations. But recent work that's primarily driven by researchers at the University of Amsterdam, but there's also a larger community around this, has used idiographic person-specific models with dynamic structural equation modeling to investigate social media effects. And here they're drawing on intensive longitudinal data collected with ESM methods. And this work has shown that these associations between various forms of social media use and various forms of well-being, it varies substantially in both direction and magnitude across individuals. So in the slides that I've got on the screen there, we can see that there's a small proportion who experience positive effects, a small proportion who might experience negative effects, and then for the large majority in these studies, these adolescents didn't experience any positive or negative effects of their social media use. Of course, this research is more of a starting point. So the idea is to dig into those at either end of the spectrum there to understand what is it about the characteristics of usage. What is it about the particular individuals who are robust or resilient, and what is it about those who are negatively or positively affected, and how can we go and study those further? And of course, also combine this with behavioral measures that capture nuanced aspects of social media use. So combine this person-specific approach with these more nuanced data to look at how reactions, perspectives, mindsets vary at the individual level, and how these elements interact with context and content to shape the experiences of positive or negative effects. I think I should perhaps also acknowledge here that while these methods are promising, they're also intense and expensive. So this data that I've got on the screen here, this is from about 500 adolescents who for 2 weeks completed 10 surveys a day. That's not a burden-free way of collecting data. And I had a conversation with the author of this this paper and at a talk, and one of the things that was generally agreed on and generally coming to realize in this area is that we don't need as many one-off single country studies focusing on this. We need to pool our resources to conduct these large-scale studies that are quite intensive, expensive, and at least go beyond, in this case, European-only or Dutch-only populations. There's very little research on how social media interacts with well-being and mental health in the global South. I don't have a slide on the screen here, but a recent analysis done at University of Cambridge, I'm collaborating with the authors there. We looked at essentially who is studying this and how much research attention is afforded to this across the world. And there's very little in South Africa, and there's very little in other parts of South America and certain parts of Asia. Now, the final methodological advancement that I want to draw attention to, I want to highlight here, concerns the use of formal modeling to generate, evaluate, and develop theories here, as well as then the use of machine learning to leverage new data sources in this area. So, as I hope you picked up from the bulk of my talk, social media use and its effects are complex. It's not simple linear relations that most of the literature relies on. And in response to this complexity, we need research paradigms that are suitable to study complex processes. And at a theory level, in most cases, we use verbal theories to describe relations between constructs. So, for example, social media use will be correlated with increased depression, as an example. But with formal modeling, we can go beyond these verbal theories to describe behavior in terms of mathematical equations, essentially. And we can use these models to generate simulated outputs. So in this case here, this is an example looking at, where is this example here? I can't remember exactly what is in the example that I've got on the screen, but this is showing how this is for perceived threats and arousal. And I'm working with a researcher in Michigan on looking at this in the context of multitasking and how this interacts with attention and distraction. And these formal modeling approaches, which are gaining prominence in many areas of the social sciences, allow us to specify very specific mechanistic descriptions of how elements relate to each other, and they come with less flexibility, which might be seen as a bad thing, but that also comes with less researcher degrees of freedom and less chance of biases entering our models. And the main benefit, I think, is they force us to generate point estimates for our theoretical predictions. So if we say that something has a relationship, we have to specify the magnitude of that relationship, and what is it that affects those elements there. They can also facilitate analyses at different levels. So they can enable us to simultaneously bridge this gap between individual and group level processes, which we can then combine models of behavior of individuals with agent-based models that describe the interactions between individuals within a system. Which brings me to the last advance that we highlight in this paper, which is essentially another response to complexity and the availability of large-scale social media data sets, which is machine learning. So here in the computational social sciences, we're seeing massive increases in the use of machine learning to model and analyze social processes. So again, I'm working with researchers at Cambridge on machine learning approaches for predicting mental health from smartphone data. I've got my honor students here working on using machine learning to model communication about digital well-being anxieties online. And later this year in November, I'm going to be in Germany on a research fellowship where we're going to be trying to develop new machine learning tools to enable us to extract and classify usage behavior on smartphones using computer vision. So there's lots of opportunities here to leverage new data sources that we can't necessarily do with more traditional techniques. So crash course, what is machine learning? So essentially it's a set of analytical approaches that we can use statistical models to draw inferences from data. So we can think of three types of machine learning that I've got on the slide here. So we've got supervised learning, which involves training a model on some what we call labeled data, and then using this model on some other new data set. And at its simplest level, this is exactly the same as what you've done when you fit a regression model, a logistic regression, a linear regression, whatever the case might be there. You can perform that exact same task in a machine learning approach or in a more traditional hypothesis testing approach. We've got unsupervised learning, where essentially we have no explicit outcome variable, and the analysis aims to infer these possible relationships between all of the various data points. And here again, clustering principal components analysis, a very common analytical tools in the psychology tool analysis tool set, can actually be done as machine learning approaches as well. And then the third approach, which I've got at the bottom of the screen there, is called reinforcement learning. And this essentially conceptually resembles the idea of conditioning. So it works through trial and error and reinforcement to identify patterns in the data. And depending on the task that we're working on here, we can use these techniques to work through large, massive social media data sets to help us answer key questions about effects. So studies are starting to use machine learning to seek to predict individual differences in well-being from data on various actions on a platform, where we might have 50,000 participants who are performing hundreds, if not thousands, of actions per day, and we're trying to understand how their well-being is affected by their actions on these platforms. And that would not be possible without these types of techniques to work with that level of data. So on this whirlwind tour, what are the main takeaways here? Research on social media effects is not yet able to adequately understand whether, how, and for whom social media use is supportive or detrimental for users' mental health and well-being. For too long, we've used very simple models and methods that have essentially plagued this area of research. And only in the last few years have we actually started to use methods that provide us with sufficient accuracy and nuance to actually see what is going on here. So in light of these challenges, I urge caution when engaging with articles in the media about negative effects of social media. That's not to say that effects aren't there. I'm sure that they are. We can especially see this in qualitative work. But most empirical work or most quantitative work at this point lacks sufficient nuance to adequately understand basically what is going on here. The methods that I've highlighted in this talk, I hope over the next couple of years will enable us to advance our understanding of how social media relates to well-being, to bring us closer to unpacking how, when, for whom, why social media can enhance or diminish our well-being. And that's where I'll leave you. Thanks for coming. Thanks for tuning in today. And I think we've got 10 minutes for questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Doug. That was beyond interesting, not only in trying to just sort of understand where the field is at in terms of social media use and and the overlap with behavioral data and research as well, but also just hearing about all of the statistical methods that you're involved in, and also just your collaborations all over, and the upcoming work that you have in November. This is quite incredible. So thanks so much for sharing it, and also in a way that is that was quite easy to understand and to follow. I think many of us who attended the talk would love to have further conversations with you about specific methods that you're using and try to understand that a little bit more. And of course, I'm looking forward to the work that we're doing on the social media mindsets. I have a lot to learn from you about that. I see we have one hand from Daniel, and then colleagues, we will probably just have time for this one comment or question from Daniel. And for those of you who would like to engage with Doug a little bit more, please do make use of his contact details, or let me know if I need to share those with you. So thanks so much, Daniel. Go ahead.
Thanks. Great talk, and I definitely will be emailing you. So you talked about measuring nuance. I'm building a mental health platform that measures mental health, or determinants of mental health, and then guides users to psychological content. So like one of the thoughts I had, because you're talking about logging data or usage, is introducing sort of like timestamps or milestones as they go through certain processes on a platform. So it's not social media per se, but engaging with different types of content. So I was wondering if you had specific suggestions onto how more meaningfully measure user engagement, and then how that data can be used to improve machine learning development. And are you looking for partners to share data to build machine learning processes, basically? That was a multi-level question.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a couple of answers to the question. The big challenge is there was a momentous event for a negative event that happened about a year ago, I suppose. I'm sure we all experienced ChatGPT, but one of the major downsides of that is huge. The models were trained on lots of social media data collected through various APIs that researchers could access. So up until earlier this year, many of the platforms had researcher streams where you could sign up as a researcher, provide your credentials, and get access to data on the platforms. And in response to large language models being trained on social media data, many of these platforms removed all research access. So we're in this weird time at the moment where huge amounts of the data sources that we used to use are now gone. And I was at a workshop in Switzerland earlier in the year, and we were essentially trying to come up with answers to how do we respond to this? What do we do? Because a lot of our previous techniques that we used to use would give us access to these high-level data sources. But now, if we're wanting to get more nuanced, we've lost these accesses. And at least one of the main ways that we're hoping that this will work is, I'm not sure if you followed much to do with the DSA, the Digital Services Act in the EU, which is developing or has developed a set of regulations for what's called VLOPs, very large online platforms. Any platform with more than 40 million users has to comply with this regulation, which essentially will make provision for researchers to gain access through a vetting process that preserves privacy and so on to participants' data on the platforms, which hopefully next year, when it comes into effect, once we jump through all the various hoops, will enable us to gain access to more fine-grained data than what you can get from an app. Prior to that, until we have something like that, installing apps on people's phones. So I know a few researchers in the UK have developed apps which we can then put on our participants' phones, which tell us about what apps they're using, when they're using those apps, and various things to do with that, to then build these models of behavior. But getting inside the platforms is the real challenge, and in a democratic way. So I've spoken with lots of researchers who have worked with Facebook, and I've worked with Firefox myself, but that's not something that can scale. You can't have thousands and thousands of external researchers partnering with Facebook on a one-on-one basis. You need infrastructure and systems to manage that. But I'll paste something in the chat quickly, which is an example of that might be relevant to you if you're interested in tracking usage and developing sort of so-called early warning systems around mental health. This is one of the most prominent projects in this area, and they've got a lot of details on the methods that they're using to track this there. It's by a clinical psychologist in, I think, Leiden, around an early warning system to track for depression, essentially, based on Garmin watches as well as smartphone tracking features.
Very cool. Thanks very much. I'll engage with you later. Cheers.
Thanks, Daniel. And thanks, Doug. I think that was about the time that we had for questions this afternoon. So I encourage anybody else who has comments or questions for Doug to please connect with him via email. Doug's very quick to respond. So thank you so much, Doug, and thank you everyone for your time this afternoon. And for ending the Colloquium series this year on a very high note. So thanks so much, Doug, and good luck with all of your endeavors that remain for the rest of this year. Thanks, everyone, and we'll resume again next year. Thanks. Bye.